Good evening. Welcome. My name is Peter Knox, and I'm the director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities here at Case Western Reserve University. And because we are a university and we have a lot of things going on, we have a little musical accompaniment, which I'm assured will cease at or around 5:30. So in the meantime, we'll just soldier on through. But on behalf of the university, I want to welcome you to this, the opening keynote address of the 2018 Keithley Symposium. This is the inaugural event in what we hope will be a continuing series of interdisciplinary conversations about art in the world and the world in art. Here in the Baker Nord Center, we like to think that we are creating a safe space where faculty, students, and members of the community can feel comfortable getting out of their comfort zones, exploring new ideas, testing long-held assumptions, challenging deeply held beliefs. One of the extraordinary advantages of doing this here in Cleveland is the rich and diverse array of educational and cultural institutions that share our mission and vision. And the most important partner for Case Western Reserve University in this enterprise is our friend and neighbor just across the street, the Cleveland Museum of Art. The Keithley Symposium is both a celebration of and a manifestation of the historic partnership between our Department of Art History and the museum. From the perspective of the university, this collaboration has taken on new and vigorous life under the leadership of Art History's new chair, my friend and colleague, Betsy Bowman. Now, friend and colleague are not always treated as synonyms, but they certainly are in this case. Betsy and her partners at the CMA have put together a wonderful program, and I hope that many of you will be able to take advantage of the events going on across the street at the museum tomorrow. And I want to acknowledge some of the people who have helped in this. Syra Levinson, the Deputy Director and Head of Public and Academic Engagement, Heather Lamonides, Deputy Director and Chief Curator, Kijo Lee, Assistant Director for Academic Outreach, and Per Knutas, the Eric and Jane Nord Chief Conservator, are only some of the museum staff who have contributed their time and talents to this project. Watching Betsy and her colleagues working together with our partners at the CMA has reminded me of how wonderful a thing academic collaboration can be. Ideas race around the table when these people get together, but there has to be someone to capture those ideas and translate them into reality. And so we've been extraordinarily lucky to benefit from the organizational talents of Maggie Kaminsky, the administrative director of our Baker Nord Center, and Rachel Ardzwaga, executive assistant in the museum's Office of Public and Academic Engagement. Finally, none of this would be possible without the help of deeply engaged supporters like Nancy and Joseph Keithley. But of course, there are no supporters like Nancy and Joseph Keithley. Yes, their generous gift will support the establishment of the Keithley Institute for Art History, elevating our joint program to national and international prominence. And it supports events like this. But beyond that, Nancy and Joe have become welcome members of our academic community, friends and advisors to faculty and museum staff, cheerleaders for our students, and powerful advocates to the community. So with thanks to all these good people, and to many more than I have time to mention by name, I want to turn the podium, if we had a podium, over to another good friend and colleague, Bill Griswold, Director and President of the Cleveland Museum of Art, who will introduce our keynote speaker, the distinguished sculptor and installation artist, Jim Hodges.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I like this, a musical accompaniment. Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you all for being here for what promises to be a really fantastic early evening presentation. It is a particular pleasure to stand before you this evening as we inaugurate, as you've heard, a new program which promises both to deepen the museum's long-standing partnership with our neighbor, Case Western Reserve University, and to pave the way for a new chapter in that very important relationship with the establishment in the near future of the Keithley Institute of Art History. The first ever Keithley Symposium, Life of an Object, the Thinker as Prism, represents a collaboration between the Cleveland Museum of Art on the one hand and the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities and the Department of Art and Art History at Case Western Reserve University on the other. And this and future symposia will emphasize an interdisciplinary approach, as that collaboration suggests, allowing for a diversity of perspectives on, in this case, the multiple and mutable lives of works of art, whose appearance and purpose and meaning may all change over time. This afternoon, before introducing our speaker, I want to reiterate our collective gratitude to Joe and Nancy Keithley, without whom we simply would not be here today, and without whom we would not have the distinct pleasure of hearing this evening and tomorrow from scholars and artists and curators and conservators of international renown about a topic that is no less intriguing than it is complex. So thank you, Joe and Nancy, again, for your enormous generosity. In addition, I too just want to recognize briefly Betsy Bowman, Peter Knox, Heather Lamonides, Syra Levinson, and their colleagues, not only at the museum, but also here at the university, for their creativity and hard work in setting the stage for the exchange of ideas that will take place tonight and throughout the day tomorrow. The lines of inquiry that we'll explore were inspired by the museum's famous cast of Rodin's celebrated bronze sculpture, The Thinker. Developed as a part of the Gates of Hell, cast in 1913 and acquired by the Cleveland Museum of Art 4 years after it came into being, that sculpture was, as is widely known here in Cleveland, violently knocked from its pedestal in an explosion in 1970. And it has been preserved in its altered condition to the present day. In its current state, The Thinker speaks not only to Rodin's place in the history of art, but also to the conflicted social and economic landscape of Vietnam-era Cleveland. Tonight's keynote address and tomorrow's panels and afternoon workshops will examine objects from our encyclopedic collection through multiple lenses. And the first of those lenses, the first perspective that will be offered, will be that of Jim Hodges. Based in New York, Jim Hodges has, over the past 30 years, produced a remarkable body of work that makes transformative use of ordinary materials. Through simple gestures, he has created works of enormous poignancy, employing such unorthodox media as paper napkins and spider webs, artificial flowers, and even human saliva. His work has been the subject of numerous solo exhibitions at such institutions as the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Camden Arts Center, London, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. Most recently, his career was the subject of a major retrospective that traveled from the Dallas Museum of Art to the Walker Arts Center, the ICA Boston, and LA's Hammer Museum. He is, of course, the recipient of numerous awards. Jim Hodges' work often possesses an ephemeral quality, as, for example, in the diaphanous curtain of hand-sewn flowers titled In Blue in the museum's collection. Others are more monumental in scale, but similarly transform the spaces that they inhabit. An example is Untitled Bridge of Harmony, which the museum acquired just 4 or 5 years ago in 2014, and which is composed of 3 massive boulders faced with veneers of high-gloss stainless steel, creating a mysterious presence animated by light not far from our north entrance just across the street. Mortality and transformation and the passage of time are central to Jim Hodges' practice. The art that he has produced resonates with the topic of this year's Keithley Symposium, and so we are tremendously grateful to him for being here with us to share his perspective as we embark upon a day and a half of exploration of the birth and meaning and afterlife of works of art. It is my privilege to introduce Jim Hodges. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those, for the beautiful introduction, and also for thanks to Case Western for having us and hosting us here tonight, and for this collaboration. I don't know. I'm I'll try to speak much louder because that's kind of loud, and but it's good for me because it's irritating, and then I'll not think about what I'm supposed to be saying and think about something else. I want to start with you know, a couple of months ago the museum a long time ago, they contacted me and asked if I would participate in the symposium and be here tonight with you. And of course, I said yes. But a few months ago, the museum contacted me and said, "We need a title for what your talk is." And I was very much still in the scattered, you know, who knows, gripping at things and wondering what exactly it was that I was going to talk about. But something that I knew I wanted to talk about and would be, is that the end of that? We should all be clapping, I think. Bravo. Is that I wanted to be talking about the thinker, and that I had some many opinions and some very troubled thoughts regarding the thinker in its current condition. So I titled the work before the drums start. Tonight's presentation as troubling thoughts, and I never title my work. Rarely, I should say, rarely do I ever give something a title until I'm finished with it, and usually the title arrives through the process of making the work, and the work tells me its name, if you will. So to title something way before I even have the materials in hand, really, was unusual. But I was thinking that I'm very happy with Troubling Thoughts. And if I were to change it today, I may add some extra words, like, oh no, troubling thoughts, or maybe not so troubling thoughts, but troubling thoughts for sure. So tonight, I'm attempting to lay a kind of, to establish some kind of boundary, if you will, or to throw out some markers so we can start finding some places and set up some landmarks for us in the discussions that will unfold tomorrow. And in that process, I think of what I'm going to try to do for us tonight is to take us on a kind of a tour. And so think of us all on a tour bus. And I'm the crazy one in the front of the bus who's talking to you guys and gals. And I'm going to try to point out to you as many things that I can, many details and as many things that I know and many things that I think about of the terrain that is around us, around this piece. And so as a tour guide, remember that I'm only going to be able to tell you things that I can see from where I sit and where I stand, how I viewed the thing, and that your perspectives and where you're sitting may conflict with things that I'm seeing, and that's okay, and then we may align. And so I guess to start out, I just want to tell you all that I'm speaking fully tonight from my point of view, and that my perspective is mine. At times I know I suffer from blind spots. I'm not able to see everything all at once. But for this subject, I've tried very hard to try to fill it out somehow. So that's my introduction to the introduction. Can you hear me without this thing? I said I don't want a pedestal because I really want to sit and be like at my table. So here I am. I want to thank the Cleveland Museum and everyone at the museum who's dedicated their time and worked so hard to organize this symposium. I'm going to go back and forth to reading things. I'm not used to reading things. I like rather this kind of conversation, but I have to because I don't want to miss points. So I also wanted to thank Case Western and everyone here involved. and in this project for joining forces with the museum and co-hosting us for this event that brings the public reflections and conversations in response to works of art that are at times violently attacked and the life expectancy of the art object. I'd like to thank all the participants in the symposium for their thoughtful responses and generosity and willingness to address these complicated topics. I personally have been obsessed with and haunted by the subject of the thinker for months in preparation for this event, and I'm sure that tomorrow will provide us with plenty of reflection and wonderful discussions that will unfold. I've already said this part. I'm going to say it again. Everything I'm sharing with you this evening is my personal thought and opinion, and I'm not intending to summarize or simplify or reduce the complexity of the issue of the care of a life of an object. I'm going to give you from how I see and experience things and set the stage, I hope, for a lively exchange tomorrow. Conversation is not only a refined, conservation is not only refined technical practice, it is also an evolving philosophical discipline with a rich and complicated history. And I'm extremely grateful to Christian Schneiderman for his expertise and thoughtful insight that he shared with me in preparation for this evening. Before I start, I want to remind everyone, I am not a Rodin scholar, I am not an art historian, I am not a curator or a conservator or a museum professional. I'm an artist, practitioner, and tonight, a tour guide. Sorry. And I will be addressing the subject of this damaged artwork from my limited realm of understanding and expertise, which I assure you is limited. My approach and methods to address the subject are an outcome of an organic process that I utilize for making all of my work. My approach as a sculptor is intuitive. I follow instructions and cues that I am sensing internally and externally. My process is one where I am continually in an editing process, reducing and refining until I arrive at a precise end. With curiosity, I approach ideas dimensionally, in the round, trying to see problems from every angle and to address each detail as it arises with purpose and distinction. The end result takes many varied forms, but my process is always the same. My approach is to inflate an idea, like blowing up a balloon, and then while examining it from all angles, start editing. Editing, 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 to reduce and refine, and this is how I have tried to construct this narrative along a sculptural path, chipping away at the stuff that confuses and isn't serving the intention, which is to arrive at clarity, specific ideas, and clear expressions of them. So my approach to the subject is based on my experience as a maker and someone who spends most of their time thinking about art, what it is, and how it occurs and is experienced. I identify with the artist. My concern is for the art and art's function and usefulness, with the utmost respect paid to artistic intention based on the evidence that is provided to us by the artist's choices and how they are manifested. A work itself carries the logic and reasoning of its being. All information is present and accounted for and has been composed to appear, sound, look, move, etc., exactly as the artist intends. There is nothing extra or needed in a completed work other than the work waiting for us to engage and complete a circuit of energy, an exchange of transmission, and in so co-create, quote, art, end quote, experience. This process, this reality of art's mechanics occurs across the spectrum, the expanding spectrum of human expression in all of its forms and disciplines. No piece of music you hear or poem read is not an exact sculpted composition by an artist or artists. With art, everything matters unless it doesn't, and then it's gotten rid of by the artist. Art is endowed with reason, logic, and purity and truth. Its logic and meaning realized in its maker's choices. An artist is judged on their efforts, and these are weighed against the history of art and the aspirations we have for a future. Our human story is written and recorded in thousands of years of invention and exquisite manifestation of ideas cast across the planet. From civilization to civilization, art has been brought forth from the very beginning, when we first crawled from the mud and started scratching on cave walls. Artists generate with intention. There is nothing casual about it. Finished works of art are an outcome of discipline, rigor, and courage, and a single, universal, consistent component held in every evidence of artistic pursuit is love. Love. The human heart is present in art. Nothing that we have been given in art, in the work of art, is left to chance by the artist. Even when an artist chooses methods and materials that invite accident and expose them and us to randomness, this too is considered and directed by the artist through their choices. Art is risky. It is risky to do and extremely risky to collect and to be burdened with the responsibility of caring for it. Thankfully for all of us, there are plenty willing to take risks. We all benefit from the willingness, dedication, and generosity. Is everyone okay? Sorry I'm reading this to you. I wish I could recite it in a way that I think you would get all the points, but I don't think I could, so. In 1964, Yoko Ono put on her best suit, sat on a stage of an auditorium, and placed in front of herself a pair of scissors. She sat still and vulnerable and welcomed all in attendance to approach her and to cut pieces of her clothing and take them away with her. The artist sat, unmoving, while people slowly began cutting at her clothing. Slowly, someone would come up, pick up the scissors, and take a snip. It started, as I said, calmly and slowly, and as the piece was progressing into the performance, became a little bit more aggressive until the artist ended the work. Art is risky, and art is very smart. In her work, Cut Piece, the artist set up a system of exchange and consumption that was metaphorically rich, that illustrated the co-creation of art experience while taking all of us, including yourself, into the realm of the unknown. She exposed more than just her skin when she invited the intervention, and not one person knew what would happen. Making oneself vulnerable is required to be an artist. Art is risky, and art is intentional. Intention is actively present and operating whenever we witness, take in, participate in art's manifestation in all its many forms, iterations, and disciplines. We experience artists' choices when we engage in relationships with art experiences. Rodin's a thinker as it is currently being displayed here in Cleveland, and as it is being viewed for over 50 years since the bombing, has taken on an accumulation of content that stems from a violence that was committed on it and recorded in its materials in a flash that they were ripped apart and being erased simultaneously. Losing critical details that had been carefully molded in place with precision by the artist, and as a result of the institution's decision to not take aggressive restoration measures at the time, decisions made in a state of post-traumatic stress, no doubt, and based on limited ability and technical refinement and fear of doing even greater harm, while trying to recapture what was lost. The subsequent deformed work has been burdened with social and symbolic content that confuses the work's original form, while the flayed scraps of dismembered limbs disrupts and cripples the sculptural performance that was intended for us to experience by the artist. This interruption, the blast itself, becomes the subject, or at least it's locked in a wrestling match with Rodin for our understanding. This added content and disruption robs the work of its specificity and clouds the air we move through when approaching with curious eyes and inquiry towards the object. In an attempt to see and locate the original, the blasted context becomes an exercise of our imagination, a distraction that creates spectacle of the work and our experience. This interruption does damage to us and to our experience, and stands in the way of our direct access to the meaning that was the original score, the original performance that was intended for the work. So that when each new person, each new viewer, repeating of the attack is played on a continuous loop, droning a violent narrative into a hypnotic-like pulse that was installed the instant the bomb exploded. And this crime is repeated over and over again, each time the work is approached, again and again, like a sick, sad, endless, haunted loop that can't stop. Boom, boom, boom. That sound itself, taking form, captured in the metal and hijacking the original while tearing and ripping at the legs and feet and the bronze crafted rock that supported this still contemplative figure, now forever trapped in a repeating violence captured so perfectly in bronze. Bronze is a very specific material. It's a material meant to last, and it does. It was one of the artist's favorite materials that he turned to when a work that he had maybe worked on for decades was decided to be released and brought into the public. Bronze is meant to last, and we can see that it does, and see how long it should be left in a state of damage. With ripped apart limbs, flared seat, and now with an additional support device needed, as you can see at the bottom of the sculpture, needed to hold the figure up, so at least it is oriented as the artist had intended it to be. I don't think it is unreasonable for many to dwell on the deformed work as it appears today and wonder all kinds of things about it, and read into it ways that the artist would never have dreamed, and certainly the context invites inquiry as it sits in a place of honor, a place of pride, at the step of the front of the museum. What is this saying? Personally, when I happened upon it for the first time a few years ago, I didn't know whose work it was. I didn't know what I was looking at. I was in Cleveland, visiting in preparation for the museum, acquiring a work of mine, and doing a site visit. And as I was touring the grounds of the museum, I walked the campus and wandered up to the side of the front step and thought, what is this? And I'm circling it and was kind of puzzled. And I went back and met Reto, who was the curator at the time, and we were meeting in the brand new atrium, this beautiful atrium space. And I said, what's on the front of the, what's on the front step? He said, oh, you mean the Rodin? And I was shocked. I said, the Rodin? What do you mean, the Rodin? And it was the first time I ever heard the story of the bombing. And it was, and because I was so puzzled with the work, I thought, wow, I can't be the only person seeing this for the first time who may not have seen the sign, the plaque on it, who would be confused. And I said to him at the time, I said, oh, you need to take that sculpture off the front step and you need to bring it here in this amazing atrium space. And then we need to invite all of us here around this thing, and we need to talk about this, because this thing is sitting out there and it's not right. This is me speaking, of course. And I said, we need to do something about it. And so anyway, this was 4 years ago. I don't know how the symposium is occurring now. And I really hope that what I'm saying fits into your all's plan for what the symposium is. But I am so grateful to be able to be here. The difference is that my fantasy symposium for us is that we're sitting with this sculpture in the museum itself. And we're actually in this place, this meeting ground, this town square of experiences, this very and very important crossroads for knowing who we are and what we're about. And it's all happening in that place. So we'll just transport ourselves for a second. Okay. What do we know? We know on March 24th, 1970, shortly after midnight, an anonymous person or persons placed what was determined to be 3 pieces of dynamite or their equivalent at the bottom of the sculpture and blew it up. The attackers also scribbled some message on the pedestal, which we won't spend any time talking about. I don't care what they thought. I don't care who they thought they were attacking. I don't understand what their reasons are. I think that line of inquiry is interesting. It's interesting and it deserves pursuit. But it derails us, me, if I am attempting to get to something about the work itself and address what I think is truly needed, which is the attention to the artwork. We know the museum initially had intended to restore the work, but in the process of determining how the conservation would take place, it was decided at the time to not take any action and return the work to its pedestal with the damage visible and add a plaque that informs those who can read English and see it that the work was, quote, vandalized. We know that the work is one of over 20, I think as many as 29 casts made of the image at this scale, but it is one of only 3 that were made during the artist's lifetime. This fact, this distinction, also added additional complications to decision making on how or what to do with the work once it was so seriously damaged. We know that the image was of the thinker in its original form was scaled back, was scaled much smaller, and combined with over 200 other figures and groups, creating a large grand work that the artist worked on and would return to for decades into his life, and was never fully realized, and the artist never lived to see the piece cast in bronze. And it's known as the Gates of Hell, which is referring to the Inferno from Dante's epic poem, the Divine Comedy. The thinker, as you see from the very top center, the thinker was originally depicting to be depicting the poet Dante. This particular work, The Gates of Hell, the artist extracted imagery and other forms for, including the kiss and the shades, which are some of his other major works. What else do we know? We know that the thinker was a generous gift to the museum. that it entered into the museum's collection within a year of the museum opening, and it became a pillar of what has become one of the most important Rodin collections in the United States, if not the world. We know that when the work was originally installed at the museum in 1917, it was placed inside, in the rotunda of the original building, where it resided for a brief period until it was decided to be placed outside, which was a decision made that was to, I think, it was believed that it was the artist's intention that the work be viewed outside, and the work was outside. We know that once placed outside, almost immediately, the patina, the surface of the sculpture, began to change due to the weather and environmental conditions, and that this became an ongoing issue and a cause of concern up until the work was attacked, and still remains an ongoing conservation issue today, as all outdoor works are susceptible to the elements. The museum has compiled and maintains a hefty record, growing record, I would assume, of conservation efforts and applications of varied techniques and methods to arrest the changing patina and bring it back to what it was when it was, quote, original. And this document is a very interesting and kind of tragic comedy of chasing an ideal in a certain way, but it also speaks, I think, to a kind of passion and a kind of commitment that we make to art and those who are burdened with caring for it. We know that one of the three artist lifetime castings of The Thinker is here in Cleveland, and that another one was selected by the artist to become his tombstone. And when he died, it was placed over his grave, where it is today, at the Rodin Museum in Paris. We know that there have been dozens of articles and extensive commentary written on the damaged work, and we know that the image of the object intact, The Thinker, is one of the most recognizable, iconic images of the human form, along with perhaps the David, Mona Lisa, to name a few. The Thinker is a treasure, and Rodin is a treasure maker. What else do we know? We know that the museums are places of made up of people, and that people are vulnerable and fragile, and that we are also resilient, strong, and stable, and capable of changing many things and evolving. I mentioned earlier about the decisions that were going into the crisis that had occurred when the sculpture itself was attacked. And I think it's important that we reflect for a few minutes on trauma and the effects of this kind of attack, and what it must have felt like for those people who not just worked at the museum, but also citizens of Cleveland, and what it must have felt like to have something that was seeming almost, I would imagine, first of all, a cherished object that was somewhat defenseless. And here it is attacked, and that I would assume that having had that experience and that sense of loss, that making a decision on what to do next must have been a very, very difficult and a huge challenge for the group of people who are taxed and burdened with that decision. How do we move forward after this horror has occurred? So I think all of us know what it's like to have some kind of loss and some kind of shock like this. Losing something, especially something we love, is devastating. And it knocks us, all of us, off of our feet. And recovering from this kind of trauma and this kind of attack is, it has its own reason and its own way of, of happening. Shock can cause us to get derailed, and it frightens us, possibly even into inaction. We freeze and we stall. Everything I'm saying is me. I'm not projecting any of this onto you guys. You guys are all going to experience your pain, your suffering, your loss. However, I'm just throwing this out there. So if I'm saying we, I mean I. Time takes on different dimensions in loss. It can seem to slow and drag, or it can speed up and slip away from us. Our tempo, our intimate internal process awakens according to our ability to process, and then we start to recover. There is no set time or prescription for recovery. It takes what it takes. Staying open and alert to our process is the best we can do, and paying attention to what paying attention that we don't slip and become seduced by our own suffering and begin to identify with our victimhood and lose ourselves in the process. Additional problems and even ailments can come to life if we linger and indulge in our own suffering. I'm sorry if what I'm saying is upsetting anyone. I really can only speak for myself and how I experienced trauma. I'm not trying to be reductive, and I'm certainly not trying to put us all in the same place. I'm trying to get us aligned, and in the context of what the people of the museum were dealing with on a personal level when they were attacked. They had to feel like targets themselves, and on some level, as I am sure many citizens felt, were frightened and feeling terrorized and were destabilized by the crime, and not to mention angry and confused. Thank you for letting me tour us through that part of the story. I think that it's in addressing something as important as a priceless piece of artwork is no different than thinking about ourselves, that we are fragile and we are priceless, and that we need care and to be tended to. And in that process, we suffer loss and experience trauma. And it is not, it's not something that we as a group, as a society, have a lot of opportunity to share with each other, but it's something that all of us carry with us, and it affects all of us. And thank you for letting me talk about that. Before the work was damaged and given this complicated identity, it wasn't intended to be a monument of any kind of specific trauma or anything associated with terrorism or violence. It was not intended to be a testament to our ability to overcome tragedy, as one writer put it in some of the material that I read. The work needs restoration, or it needs to be contextualized more fully so that the complicated story of it is more accessible. If this work is to remain in its damaged state, then there must be more made of it, so that more than just a simple plaque that acknowledges vandalism. I think more could be said and more should be done to inform an audience. The decision to conserve is one the museum will make, possibly, based on many, many considerations. Technology today provides us with enough proficiency and ability to restore everything to its original condition. 3D scanning and rendering now can do incredible works that 50 years ago would never have been possible. The work, what's left of it, could be restored and recovered with precision and care, be brought back to its original form, freed from the wreckage it is currently stuck in. Let me share with you a horror story that happened at another museum in 2002. On Sunday night, shortly after the Metropolitan Museum of Art closed, a wooden pedestal that had been supporting a priceless marble sculpture buckled and collapsed, sending the marble figure crashing to the floor and shattering into hundreds of pieces. I'm about to show you a video. It's produced by the Met, and it will explain the story much better than I could.
It was a Monday morning, and I got to work, and I got a phone call from Jack Sultanian, and he said, "Can you come to the Blumenthal patio? There's been an incident." And he sounded very serious, so of course I went upstairs, and I saw the sculpture in pieces all over the floor. He was on a plywood pedestal, and that collapsed. It buckled underneath the weight of the sculpture.
For a piece, that important to be damaged was something catastrophic. Really high quality Renaissance sculpture outside of Italy is not common. This was an iconic piece in being one of the earliest nudes, going back to the inspiration from antiquity.
I think there's a purification of form going on here that makes it even exceptional in Renaissance depictions of Adam overall. There's this forthright and yet dreamy quality about the Tullio that set it apart.
The reaction is to document everything as it is, just like you would on a crime scene. We immediately began plotting out a grid on the floor, and then we went and took a picture of every single square. And after that, we began to pick up the pieces. He's in about 28 major fragments, but there are hundreds of very small fragments, and it was all saved. Then there was just a period of pausing and trying to come up with a general plan of what to do.
I proposed that we may be able to utilize three-dimensional imaging. If we scanned the object, we could create a virtual reconstruction and hopefully move on to doing finite element analysis of the piece.
You're taking a structure and you're basically turning it into a 3D jigsaw puzzle. The difference being that all the pieces in that puzzle are glued together. You're analyzing what's happening with each individual piece and then determining how that pertains to the entire structure because all the pieces are connected together. The color distributions that you see are graphical representations of stress distribution or displacement.
If we were to be asked, look, you have to put this together next month, we would have done what we've always done before. We would have drilled holes in every joint, used stainless steel pins, rather large and long, to put this sculpture back together and use very strong adhesives. But we wanted to say, can we step back from those materials?
We have a class of acrylic adhesives that we use commonly in conservation that are reversible. They'd never really been tested adequately for the kind of stress that the fragments of the atom would be under when they were rejoined.
So this is about an engineering, a material science approach that includes mechanical testing, computer science. What arose out of that work was the fact that these reversible adhesives are strong enough to carry some of the big joints on this sculpture all by themselves. Stones And all materials have a different strength and they have a different stiffness. And there are pinning materials that have similarly different stiffnesses. And as we assessed different pinning materials, we came to a material which needed to be stressed very, very highly to fail. But when it failed, the pin failed without damage to the stone. And that pin turned out to be fiberglass.
We sort of from the beginning felt that the ankles, because of the stress on them, you basically had the whole weight of the sculpture on a relatively small surface area, that they were going to require some pinning. We ultimately wound up drilling it only in one other area, which was this fragment in one of the knees, which was an area where the angle of stress really shifted very quickly and where there was a small fragment at the knee which lessened the stability of that joint and had to be dealt with.
The breaks on the sculpture were so fresh. We wanted to minimize the amount of times we put the pieces together, took them apart, moved things around. We sort of collectively came up with this idea, like, wouldn't it be great if we had another sculpture? And of course, we weren't just going to break any sculpture, a work of art, so we thought that we could get some kind of reproduction.
There was a possibility of getting this very ugly marble statue of David. We broke that David along the fracture lines of Adam.
And we used that to plan our armature.
There was a full-scale copy-made CNC milled piece of each and every piece of Adam.
We then applied those concepts to the milled version. Those carbon fiber straps could be taken off the model and used directly on the sculpture.
We're starting at the ankles, and we glued the two ankles, and then we stacked everything up just for the ankles. So we knew that everything was in line.
And then we slowly worked our way from the bottom up, joining the legs to the torso. We were aligning two places, all very rigid. Michael was on one leg, I was on the other, and we became very familiar with our particular joint. When you're just going stone to stone, things kind of lock together in a very nice, satisfying way. When you put the adhesive in there, things kind of move around. It's like having ball bearings in the joint, and you really need to let that adhesive kind of ooze out to create a very consistent film. I'm putting plenty on.
After years of seeing, as fragments, have the head on it and actually have it be a complete form, it was quite an amazing moment.
Sure.
Congratulations, Michael.
Nice.
You did. Luckily, the major fragments fit together very well, but in other areas, particularly in the arms and hands, there was considerable damage. In terms of the aesthetic presentation of the sculpture, it's going to be those small fills that are going to be the most critical aspect.
Over the years, dirt had accumulated on the sculpture. It was cleaned before billing any of the losses. You work on different areas of the sculpture simultaneously. The main philosophy is to have an even surface.
When it comes to putting on fills or retouching something, we always use reversible materials. We tried to get everything we could out of this horrible accident. I think in the end, he will be back to where he was. So is that the same or not? That's for everybody else to decide. But I think that the spirit of the sculpture and the true beauty of it is still there.
And conservation has come a really, really long way in 50 years, as this shows. It also shows that this was a 12-year process that the museum went through, and the documentation of the process itself became this beautiful document that they have. And when the work was reinstalled in the museum, it was installed in a room by itself, and the entire story of what had occurred was also installed with it, providing the viewers with not just the access to the work with all the debris cleared out so that there was still that cleared pathway to the object. But there was also this story that was generated that we were made aware of. And it was nice to know that the document exists besides the work still existing again in its state. I'm sorry, I've gone way longer than I was supposed to go. I'll try to, the only thing I have left to do is basically just show other examples of artworks that were damaged and fixed, and also artworks that suffered the attacks that couldn't be saved. We know that recently in Afghanistan, Buddhas that had been standing in the desert for hundreds and hundreds of years were destroyed and are no longer there. Palmyra was also attacked and bombed, and we've lost a lot of ourselves in these losses. I'm going off script, so you have to just bear with me. Rodin had something to say about his thinker. Rodin says, "What makes my thinker think is that he thinks not only with his brain, with his knitted brow and his distended nostrils and compressed lips, but with every muscle of his arms, back, and legs, with his clenched fist and gripping toes. When this bomb went off, that got blown up. Parts of that got blown up. The artist makes his work, her work, and sometimes imagines it on that trajectory, and often gets to experience that trajectory when it moves from inside the artist's studio out into the world. And when the work goes out into the world, it takes on a life of its own. It takes on a life of its own where the artist is somewhat dismissed and the work itself becomes its own thing. And the artist can't imagine really who their audience is. They can conjure an audience, imagine a room like this and think that you are the audience. But in reality, no one knows. No one knows who the work is for. In 2001, I was living in New York on 14th and 7th Avenue. The morning of September 11th, I watched the towers crumble before my very eyes. Along with thousands of my fellow citizens who lined the streets in utter and complete frozen, shocking horror. Nothing could ever prepare us for this affront and the complete, inexplicable attack on our senses and our physical reality. The shock waves that shot through me that day continued to replay for weeks into months. For months, I was off. I wasn't myself. I wasn't myself. Everything had changed, and I was struggling. One late winter, early spring day, I made my way to the Metropolitan Museum to see some paintings. While strolling through the corridors of the museum, I happened upon an exhibition of genre images depicting scenes from common life, the life of peasants and working people, rendered in engravings and intaglio prints, small works made centuries earlier, lining a blue-painted room. I was moving along with a crowd of others slowly, like a human chain, slowly from one image to the next. As I was taking in the images and hearing the sounds of Spanish spoken to the left and maybe French being heard behind me, in a flash I was brought to. In an instant I was drawn. In an instant I saw humanity. I saw the human story beautifully revealed before me in these images drawn hundreds of years earlier by an artist who would never, ever have imagined me or where the drawing or print was. I was retrieved by the artwork. I was salvaged from the despair and the shock of what had occurred, and I was found again in that gallery. The art had rescued me. It would have been impossible for anyone to make that thing occur. And it is that unknown, our inability around the mystery of art to know what ultimately the object is for. The preservation of the objects that we have so painstakingly for generations gathered and held together in spite of ourselves at times, are testaments not just to what was, but they can rescue us. In a flash, we can be brought back to our reality. This mystery is art. It's mysterious. And I have so many more things that I could really bore you with. I'm very sorry that I went so long. I do want to thank the museum, the location of the museum in society, and especially in contemporary society, the necessity for a place where people can know themselves. It is so important that we provide access so that people can know who they are. This is the purpose of art, in my opinion, and it is necessary that we clear the path, that we make art accessible for each other, and that we include everyone in that. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight and for inviting me to be participating in this, I think, extremely important conversation. And thank you.
Well, can you hear me? I want to thank you for being our tour guide this evening, taking us on a journey through the life of one work and a glimpse of the lives of others. I think that if you have questions or comments, you should feel free to approach. But before I invite you to do that, let's have another round of applause and make it loud enough for our friends next door to hear.